Phantom Phone Lines Season 0, the show featuring carefully crafted, dramatized, voicemail message-style stories of unsettling, surreal, and perhaps paranormal encounters. Without further ado, let's hear what's been left on the line.
Hi. I hope you're still taking stories. Before I start, I should probably say something right up front. If you're listening to this and thinking about getting into urban exploring because you've seen videos online and it looks fun, don't. Seriously, don't. I'm not saying that because I think every abandoned building is haunted. They aren't. Well, most aren't. What they are is dangerous. Rotting floors, mold, exposed nails, collapsing ceilings, unstable staircases, asbestos, wild animals, and sometimes people who have no interest in being found. Looking back, what happened to me could have ended with somebody falling through a floor and breaking their neck. That would have been the real horror story. But that's not what happened. This happened when I was 19 years old, during my sophomore year of college. And even now, it's one of those memories that refuses to stay buried. The weird thing is, I don't think about it all the time. Months can pass without it crossing my mind. Then something will remind me of it. A certain smell, an old house, a dusty attic, a photograph. And suddenly, I'm right back there. Back in college, a bunch of us thought it would be fun to explore an abandoned farmhouse outside town. Looking back, it was a dumb idea. The place was falling apart, full of mold, broken floors, and probably every safety hazard you can imagine. At the time, though, we thought it sounded exciting. We were 19. 19-year-olds have a remarkable ability to confuse dangerous with interesting. There were 6 of us. Me. My roommate, a friend who was the sort of person who treated every bad idea like a personal challenge, and girls from our history class. The farmhouse had become one of those local legends that circulated around campus. Everybody knew somebody who had been there. Nobody seemed to know who owned it. Nobody knew exactly why it had been abandoned. The stories changed depending on who was telling them. One version claimed a family had simply moved away decades earlier. Another involved a bankruptcy. Another involved a fire. By the time the story reached college students, there were already rumors about ghosts and disappearances. Naturally, those were the versions we paid attention to. One Saturday afternoon, we decided to go. It wasn't even nighttime. That's the funny part. Whenever people hear abandoned farmhouse, they imagine flashlights and midnight adventures. Nope, it was broad daylight. Sunny, clear skies. The kind of afternoon where nothing bad should happen. We drove out in 2 cars and parked along a dirt road. The farmhouse sat beyond a large field that had long since grown wild. Tall grass swayed in the breeze. The house stood alone in the distance. The first glimpse of it should have convinced us to leave. Even from far away, it looked exhausted. The white paint had mostly peeled away. Several windows were broken. One side of the roof sagged noticeably. The porch leaned slightly. The whole structure had the appearance of something that had been abandoned, not just by people, but by time itself. As we walked across the field, I remember feeling a strange kind of excitement. Not fear. Not yet. Just curiosity. The same feeling you get when you're about to open an old box in an attic. The sense that you might discover something forgotten. The silence struck me first. There weren't any nearby houses. No traffic. No machinery. No barking dogs. Just wind moving through grass. The house seemed isolated from the rest of the world, like its own little island. When we finally reached it, we spent a few minutes walking around the exterior. Most of the windows were dirty enough that you couldn't see inside. The back door was boarded shut. One side door hung partially open. Tyler immediately pushed it wider. The hinges groaned loudly. Then he stepped inside. The rest of us followed. The smell hit immediately. Dust, mildew, rotting wood, the stale scent of air that hadn't circulated properly in years. Sunlight filtered through broken windows and illuminated floating particles. Every step disturbed another cloud of dust. The first floor was exactly what you'd expect. A ruined kitchen, broken cabinets, wallpaper peeling in long strips, water stains covering sections of ceiling. A refrigerator sat in one corner with its door hanging open. Birds had apparently nested inside at some point. The living room contained scattered furniture, most of it damaged beyond use. At first, the experience felt more sad than spooky. You could tell this had once been somebody's home. People had celebrated birthdays there, had dinners, had ordinary lives. Now it was just falling apart. We spent nearly an hour exploring the first floor and second floor. Most rooms were empty. Some contained scattered belongings. An old dresser, a rusted bed frame, a cracked mirror. The girls found a faded photograph underneath debris in one bedroom. The image had deteriorated so badly, nobody could make out the faces. Still, she kept staring at it. Something about finding evidence that real people had once lived there made the place feel more personal. Eventually, we reached the end of an upstairs hallway, and that's where we found the attic stairs. The entrance was hidden behind a narrow door. The staircase itself looked more like a ladder, steep, unfinished, dark. My buddy volunteered to climb first. Of course he did. He was probably trying to impress the girls. The rest of us followed. The attic was enormous, far larger than I expected. Low-sloped ceilings stretched away into darkness. Wooden beams crossed overhead. Dust covered everything. And I mean everything. Furniture, boxes, trunks, shelves, the floor itself. Every surface seemed buried beneath years of neglect. Cobwebs hung everywhere. Some stretched between rafters like curtains, others draped across old furniture. The place looked untouched, frozen in time. We wandered around for a while, taking pictures, looking through old junk, making jokes. At first it felt almost disappointing. No ghosts, no mysteries, just dust and old furniture. Then my roommate found the door. It was tucked behind a stack of boxes at the far end of the attic. Small, narrow, easy to miss. The wood looked older than the surrounding walls somehow. Matt pulled it open. The hinges let out a long, painful creak. Beyond it was a room. A real room. Not a closet. Not storage space. An actual room built into the far end of the attic. Tiny. Maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. The walls were bare. The floor was bare. There was only one window. And in the center sat a large travel trunk. The thing looked ancient. Leather straps, brass corners, a thick layer of dust covering every inch. It immediately became the center of attention. We gathered around it. My friend wanted to open it. One of girls thought we should leave it alone. We started taking photographs. Everybody was talking at once. Nobody was paying attention to the window. Until one of the girls suddenly stopped speaking. I remember the exact moment, because her face changed. The expression drained away. She simply stared. Past us. Toward the window. At first nobody noticed. Then she pointed, slowly, without saying a word. I turned and saw someone standing outside. To this day, that is exactly how my brain remembers it. Someone, standing there, watching us. A pale face, dark clothing, motionless, looking directly through the glass. The image lasted maybe a second. 2 seconds at most. Then reality caught up. The window was 3 stories off the ground. There was no balcony, no ladder, no tree branches, no roofline, nothing. No place for a human being to stand. And yet I was absolutely convinced I'd seen somebody. Then the figure vanished. Not gradually, just gone. The room erupted. Everybody started talking at once. Did you see that? What was that? Was somebody there? The weirdest part wasn't that we'd seen something. The weirdest part was that nobody agreed on exactly what. One person thought it was a woman. Another thought it was a man. One person only remembered a face. Another remembered shoulders. The details differed. But every one of us agreed on the important part. We'd seen someone, or thought we had, standing outside that impossible window. The mood shifted instantly. Nobody wanted to stay. Nobody cared about the trunk anymore. The attic suddenly felt much smaller, much darker. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every creak sounded louder. We left, quickly, not running, but close. As we descended the stairs, I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see somebody standing at the attic doorway, watching us leave. Nothing was there. We made it outside, back into sunlight, back into fresh air, and immediately started trying to explain it. Reflection, dust, shadows, optical illusion, group psychology, all perfectly reasonable explanations. Even now, I believe one of those explanations is probably correct. But here's the thing. Even years later, every person who was there still remembers it. We've met up over the years. Weddings, reunions, random conversations, and eventually somebody always brings up the farmhouse. Nobody remembers exactly what classes we took that semester. Nobody remembers what we ate that day. Nobody remembers half the details of college. But everybody remembers that attic. Everybody remembers that window. And everybody remembers the feeling that somebody was looking in. The final detail happened as we walked back toward the cars. I almost didn't mention it because I'm still not sure it actually happened. I looked back one last time. The attic window was visible from the field, tiny, dark, distant. And for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure standing inside the room, looking out, watching us leave. Maybe it was a shadow. Honestly, it probably was. That's the explanation I choose to believe. Because the alternative raises a question I've never liked. If somebody wasn't standing outside that window, then who or what was standing inside afterward? Anyway, that's my story. And if you're thinking about exploring abandoned buildings, take some advice from somebody who was once a very dumb 19-year-old. Stay out of them. Most of the dangers are completely ordinary. And sometimes, ordinary is scary enough.
Hello. If you'd asked me even a month ago whether I'd ever be the kind of person calling in about something strange in a cabin, I would have said absolutely not. I'm 30-ish years old. I work in marketing. I drink overpriced coffee, make spreadsheets for fun, and read self-help books I only half finish. I'm not someone who believes every creak in an old house is a ghost. At least, I didn't think I was. But something happened to me 3 weeks ago, and I still can't fully settle it in my head. Maybe there's a completely reasonable explanation. Honestly, I hope there is. But I can't stop thinking about it. So, here goes. The trip wasn't originally supposed to be mine alone. That's important. It was meant to be this romantic little weekend getaway with my boyfriend, well, ex-boyfriend now. We'd booked the cabin months earlier. Cute little Airbnb out in the woods about 3 hours from the city. One of those places people post online with captions like disconnect and recharge or cozy woodland retreat. At the time, it felt very us. String lights, antique furniture, big clawfoot bathtub, bookshelves full of old mystery novels no one actually reads. The listing photos looked like someone had designed the entire place by typing cozy cottagecore autumn aesthetic directly into the universe. Wicker furniture, floral curtains, patchwork quilts folded over the backs of chairs, tiny lace doilies under lamps, little sachets of dried lavender and potpourri sitting in bowls around the house. The kind of place that smells faintly like cedar wood and old perfume. Very romantic weekend in the woods. Then, about 10 days before the trip, we broke up. Nothing dramatic. No cheating or screaming or thrown plates. Honestly, that almost made it worse. It was one of those painfully adult breakups where both people quietly realize they've been unhappy for longer than they admitted. We sat on the couch discussing our relationship like exhausted coworkers reviewing a failed business proposal. And afterward, I just felt hollow. Not heartbroken exactly, just displaced. Like the future I'd been casually picturing for years had suddenly been erased without warning. I thought about canceling the trip, but the cabin was non-refundable, and honestly, The idea of sitting alone in my apartment for another weekend spiraling through old text messages sounded unbearable. So I went alone. I told everyone it would be good for me. A reset. Time to think. Time away from screens and noise and people. And during the drive there, I actually started believing that. The farther I got from the city, the lighter I felt. The roads narrowed into winding forest highways lined with pine trees. Radio stations faded in and out. The air smelled colder once I rolled the windows down. By the time I reached the property that afternoon, I was almost excited. The cabin really was beautiful. Smaller than I expected, but charming in that carefully curated Airbnb way. Cream-colored wood siding. A little wraparound porch. Wind chimes hanging near the front steps. Inside, everything looked frozen in time somewhere between 1994 and a grandmother's idea of rustic elegance. Floral wallpaper, muted pink cushions, tiny ceramic angels on shelves, wicker chairs with faded cushions, artificial flower arrangements everywhere. Even the lighting felt old-fashioned, warm yellow lamps instead of harsh white bulbs. The bedroom especially looked like something out of an old bed and breakfast brochure. Huge quilted comforter, little reading lamps beside the bed, dried flowers hanging upside down near the window, and above the bed, exposed wooden ceiling beams. I remember noticing them immediately because they gave the room this cozy attic feeling. The ceiling wasn't very high, though. Maybe a foot or two above the beams before the roof sloped upward. No attic space. The first few hours there were honestly wonderful. I made tea, opened windows, walked around the property. There was a little fire pit outside surrounded by damp wooden chairs and dense wood stretching in every direction. No nearby houses. No road noise. Just wind and trees. I remember thinking, this is exactly what I needed. But something changed after sunset. And I know how cliché that sounds. Even now, part of me feels embarrassed saying it. But the cabin felt different once darkness settled around it. During the day, the floral wallpaper and old furniture felt charming. At night, it started feeling old. Not antique old. Used old. Like the cabin had belonged to many people before me. The woods outside became completely black after dark. Not city dark, real dark. The kind where the windows turn into mirrors because there's nothing outside to reflect anymore. And once I noticed that, I started keeping the curtains closed. Around 9, I made dinner and tried distracting myself with TV, but the Wi-Fi was awful and kept buffering. Eventually, I just gave up and climbed into bed with one of the mystery novels from the shelf. The cabin creaked constantly. Old wood settling. Wind brushing branches against the roof. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't fully relax. It's strange how isolation works when you're alone. At first, solitude feels peaceful. Then slowly your brain starts realizing there's nobody nearby if something goes wrong. Every sound begins standing out more sharply. Around midnight, I finally turned the lamp off and tried sleeping. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the sound woke me. A creak. Slow. Heavy. Directly above me. At first I thought it was part of a dream. Then it came again. Creak. Like a floorboard bending under weight. I opened my eyes immediately. The room was dark except for moonlight leaking around the curtains. And above me, footsteps. Slow footsteps crossing the ceiling. My brain immediately tried rational explanations. Animal. Branches. Roof shifting. But even half asleep, I knew that wasn't right. These sounded deliberate. Measured. Heavy enough that the wooden beams gave tiny groaning sounds beneath them. Step. Creak. Step. Creak. Moving slowly from one side of the room to the other. I lay completely still listening. And this is the thing that truly frightened me. Whoever or whatever it was sounded careful. Not random. Not scrambling like an animal. It sounded like someone pacing quietly so they wouldn't wake me. Except, I was already awake. I remember staring upward, trying to visualize the structure of the cabin. There couldn't have been space above me. The roof sloped low over the bedroom ceiling. I'd noticed it earlier specifically because the beams made the room feel cozy. There was no upstairs, no attic, certainly nowhere for a person to walk. Yet the footsteps continued, back and forth, slowly pacing directly above the bed. At some point I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:17 a.m. I almost called someone right then just to hear another human voice, but what would I even say? Hi, I think somebody's walking on the ceiling of my cottagecore Airbnb. Instead, I lay there listening for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, the pacing stopped, right above my head, and I swear to God, the ceiling creaked downward slightly, like weight had settled directly over me. I stopped breathing entirely. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then one final creak, and the footsteps resumed, slowly moving away across the ceiling. I did not sleep again that night. I kept every light in the cabin on until sunrise, and once daylight came, the whole experience started feeling stupid again. That's the worst part. Morning made everything rational. I walked outside and inspected the roofline like an investigator trying to debunk herself. No footprints, no damage, no branches hanging low enough to explain the sounds. I even felt embarrassed at myself a little. Old cabin noises. That's all. Isolation plus breakup, emotions plus unfamiliar surroundings. Case closed. But that night it happened again. Earlier this time. Around midnight. The exact same pacing. Slow. Heavy. Directly above the bedroom. And this time I noticed something new. The footsteps reacted to me. I know how insane that sounds. But whenever I shifted position in bed, the pacing stopped. The second I became still again, it resumed. Step, creak, step, creak. Like whoever was above me was listening too. I finally worked up the nerve to leave the bedroom and check outside. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find first, which honestly makes me laugh now because what exactly was I planning to do? Fight a raccoon? The porch air was freezing cold. The woods were completely silent. No movement. No animals. No person on the roof. Nothing. But standing outside the cabin made something else occur to me. The roof line over the bedroom was too low. There physically wasn't enough vertical space above the ceiling for someone to stand upright. At most, there might have been a narrow crawl space. And the footsteps had sounded upright. Human. Measured. Heavy. I went back inside feeling worse somehow. Because now I didn't have a practical explanation anymore. That second night, the footsteps stopped again directly above the bed. And this time, I heard something drag slowly across the ceiling. Not scratching, not claws, more like fabric, like someone lowering themselves carefully to lie flat above me. I left the next morning before checkout. Didn't even stay for the third night. I packed while the sun was up and drove home feeling ridiculous the entire way. But here's the thing I can't explain. A few days later, I went back to the Airbnb listing online, mostly to reassure myself. I looked carefully through all the photos again. Bedroom, ceiling, roof line. And in one picture, one I swear I hadn't noticed before, there was a small decorative hatch near the top of the hallway wall. Tiny thing, painted white, almost hidden. I messaged the owner asking casually what it was. She replied, "Oh, that just leads to a maintenance space above the bedroom. It's too small for anyone to use, though." That should have made me feel better. It didn't, because now I knew there really was a space above me. A narrow, dark little crawl space stretching over the bedroom ceiling. And sometimes at night, I still catch myself imagining someone lying awake up there, listening to guests breathe, waiting for the house to go quiet. Anyway, that's it. Maybe it was an animal. I mean, it had to be an animal. Maybe old cabins just make strange sounds. Maybe grief and loneliness distorted everything. But I'll tell you one thing. I don't think I'll ever stay in a cute little cabin in the woods again. especially not one with low ceilings. Bye. Good night.
Hi. I hope you're still taking stories. I've gone back and forth about calling for weeks now. Not because what happened was especially dramatic. Honestly, if I told this story to most people I know, they'd probably smile politely and tell me it was an old shed, old wood, and an overactive imagination. Maybe they're right. I hope they're right. But there's a feeling I can't shake. A feeling that started with a door that wouldn't stay closed. And maybe that sounds ridiculous. But I'll tell it exactly how it happened. About a year ago, I moved back into the house I grew up in. Not permanently, at least that was the plan. My mama had started having trouble getting around after a fall, and after my father passed away, she was living there alone. My brothers lived out of state. I worked remotely, so it just made sense. At first, I figured I'd stay 6 months, help her get settled, make sure everything was okay. Then I'd decide what came next. Life, though, has a way of stretching temporary arrangements into permanent ones. The house sat on a few acres outside a small town. Nothing fancy, just an old ranch house surrounded by pine trees, a vegetable garden, and memories. So many memories. You know how some places seem frozen in time? That house was like that. The same creaky hallway, the same faded wallpaper in the guest bathroom, the same squeaky screen door that announced every arrival before anybody knocked. And out back, the same shed. The shed sat beyond Mama's garden, maybe 50 yards behind the house. It wasn't particularly large, just a simple wooden structure my father built decades earlier. Gray weathered boards, rusty metal roof, one tiny window that had long ago become too dirty to see through. As kids, my brothers and I called it Daddy's shed. Not because he spent much time in it. Actually, looking back, that's one of the strange things. He barely ever went inside. At least not when we were around. But he was obsessed with keeping it locked. Every night before bed, he'd step onto the back porch, look toward the shed, and make sure the lock was secure. Every single night. It became such a routine that none of us questioned it. Kids don't always question the strange habits adults have. They just accept them. If Daddy checked the shed every night, then that's what fathers did. Simple as that. When we were little, we'd ask what was inside. He always gave the same answer. Old tools, rusty junk, nothing worth fooling with. That should have ended our curiosity. Naturally, it did the opposite. We spent years imagining what might be in there. Hidden money, Civil War artifacts, moonshine, a secret tunnel. One summer, my younger brother became convinced Daddy was hiding treasure. Another year, we thought maybe there was an old motorcycle inside. But none of us ever got a chance to find out. Because Daddy never left the key lying around. And if he caught us anywhere near the shed, he'd immediately tell us to move along. Not angrily, just firmly, like he genuinely didn't want us near it. As an adult, I mostly forgot about the place. Then I moved home, and the shed became part of my daily view again. The first few weeks were uneventful. I worked during the day, helped Mama around the house, cooked dinner, watched television, normal life. Then one morning I noticed the shed door standing slightly open. Not wide open, just cracked. Maybe 2 inches. Enough to notice, not enough to feel alarming. I remember thinking the wind must have caught it. So I walked out, closed it, and went about my day. Simple. The next morning it was open again. Same amount, same narrow gap. That caught my attention. I figured maybe the latch wasn't catching properly. Old wood shifts over time, especially in humid weather. Again, I shut it. Again, I moved on. But then it happened a third time, and a fourth, and a fifth. Always the same. Always just slightly open, never wide, never swinging, just enough to suggest someone had pulled it almost closed, but not completely. By that point, I started paying attention. One evening before bed, I walked all the way out there myself, checked the latch, checked the hinges, pulled the door firmly shut. Then I actually stood there tugging on it, testing it, making sure it wouldn't drift open. Satisfied, I returned to the house. The next morning, open. Exactly the same as before. That's when I mentioned it to Mama. She got unusually quiet, not frightened, just thoughtful. Then she said something I hadn't heard in years. Daddy always worried about that shed. I laughed. Well, apparently he had reason to. But she didn't laugh back. Instead, she stared out the kitchen window toward the garden. He never liked people opening it. I asked why. She shrugged, said she didn't know, or maybe she didn't want to say. With Mama, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. A few days later, I decided to finally look inside. I figured if I understood what was in there, maybe I'd understand why Daddy cared so much. The interior was disappointing. Old tools, garden equipment, paint cans, boxes, a broken lawnmower. Exactly what you'd expect. Nothing mysterious, nothing valuable, no treasure, no secret tunnel, nothing. The only thing that felt odd was how untouched everything seemed. Layers of dust covered nearly every surface. Some boxes looked like they hadn't moved in 20 years. Which raised a question. If nobody was using the shed, why did the door keep opening? That night, lying in bed, I found myself staring toward the backyard through my window. You couldn't see the shed directly, just a dark silhouette beyond the garden. And for the first time in my life, I felt uneasy about it. Not scared, just uneasy. Like there was a question I hadn't thought to ask. A week later, things escalated. I woke up around 2 in the morning needing water. As I passed through the kitchen, I glanced out the window and froze. The shed door was open. Not cracked. Open. Wide. The interior looked blacker than the surrounding darkness somehow. I stood there staring for several seconds, trying to convince myself I wasn't actually bothered. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight, went outside, walked across the yard. The entire time, I kept feeling foolish. A grown woman afraid of an old storage shed. When I reached it, I shined my flashlight inside. Nothing. Exactly the same junk I'd seen before. No intruder, no animal, no movement. I closed the door and returned inside. But something happened as I walked away. I heard a sound. Very faint. A soft scrape from inside. I stopped, turned around, listened. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was settling wood. Still, I slept poorly. After that, I started noticing other things. Small things. The rake leaning against a different wall. A toolbox shifted slightly. A folding chair standing open when I remembered it being folded. Tiny inconsistencies. The kind that could easily be bad memory. Yet they accumulated. And the more they accumulated, the more I remembered something from childhood. A conversation with my father. I couldn't have been older than 10. We were in the backyard. I pointed toward the shed and asked why he locked it every night. He looked at me strangely, then said, "Some things stay where they're supposed to if you leave them be." At the time, I thought he meant raccoons or snakes. Now I wasn't so sure. A month passed. Then came the night that finally pushed me into making this call. I was sitting on the back porch near sunset. Mama had gone to bed early. The air was warm, cicadas buzzing, everything peaceful. Then I heard it, the shed door. Creak! Slowly opening. I watched it happen. No wind, no storm, no person nearby, just the door easing open by itself. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. Then something else happened. The darkness inside shifted. Not dramatically, not like a person stepping forward, more like a shadow adjusting, a shape within shadows. I blinked. Looked again. Nothing. Just darkness. I walked out there immediately, heart pounding. Opened the door fully, shined my flashlight around. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the folding chair stood open again, facing the doorway, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the yard, watching the house, watching me. I closed the chair, closed the door, locked it, and for the first time in my life, I wished I knew what my father had been worried about. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the shed door creak again, from my bedroom. Slow, patient, opening. I never went to look. I just lay there listening. And eventually, after several minutes, I heard it close. The next morning, I found it cracked open, just a little, the same way it always was, like someone had looked inside and forgotten to shut it completely. Maybe there's a simple explanation. Maybe the foundation shifted. Maybe the hinges are warped. Maybe I've spent too much time alone in an old family home full of memories and grief That's honestly the explanation I prefer. But every evening now, I find myself checking that shed the same way my father used to. Every single night, making sure it's closed, making sure the lock is secure. And sometimes when I'm standing there in the fading light, I catch myself wondering something. Not what's inside. Not anymore. What I wonder is this. How many years was my father checking that lock because he was worried someone might get in? And how many years was he checking it because he was worried something might get out? Anyway, that's my story. Thanks for listening. And if anybody out there has experience with old sheds that won't stay closed, I'd love to hear a rational explanation. Goodbye.
Hi. I think this probably happened close to 25 years ago now. Maybe longer. Funny how some memories get blurry with age, while others stay sharp enough that you can still smell the air and hear the sounds when you think about them. This is one of those memories. And before I start, I should say right up front, I don't know if anything supernatural actually happened. I've spent most of my adult life trying to come up with reasonable explanations. Some of them are pretty good explanations, honestly. But every now and then I'll remember one specific detail, and the whole thing starts bothering me again. So I'll tell it the way I remember it. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. Not tiny, but small enough that everybody knew everybody. My grandparents lived about 15 minutes from us in an old farmhouse that had been in the family longer than anybody could remember. It sat back from the road behind a line of maple trees in a field that seemed enormous when I was a kid. The house itself wasn't particularly spooky. Actually, it was the opposite. It was the kind of place that felt safe. Warm kitchen, old wooden floors, the smell of coffee in the morning and homemade soup in the winter. My grandmother was the sort of woman who always had cookies somewhere in the house. My grandfather was quiet, not unfriendly, just quiet. The kind of man who could spend an entire afternoon repairing a lawnmower without saying more than 10 words. Everybody called him Frank. I called him Grandpa. And if there was one place in the entire house that belonged completely to him, it was the basement workshop. The workshop occupied about half the basement. The rest was storage. Boxes, old furniture, holiday decorations, the usual stuff. But the workshop was different. That area was organized with almost military precision. There was a huge wooden workbench along one wall, pegboards above it, shelves underneath. Every tool had a specific place. Every wrench, every screwdriver, every pair of pliers. Grandpa could apparently walk into that basement blindfolded and tell you if something had been moved 3 inches. As a kid, I found it fascinating, mostly because it was the exact opposite of my bedroom. My room looked like a tornado had passed through every day. His workshop looked like a museum. I remember one afternoon asking him why he cared so much about where the tools went. He didn't even look up from what he was working on, just said, "Things work better when they're where they're supposed to be." At the time, I thought he meant tools. Years later, I'm not entirely sure he did. Grandpa passed away when I was 11. Heart attack. Quick. Unexpected. One day he was repairing a tractor. The next day he wasn't there anymore. I remember the funeral, the flowers, the uncomfortable suit, the adults speaking in hushed voices. Mostly I remember how strange the house felt afterward. Not haunted, just incomplete. Like a piece of machinery missing an important gear. For a while, Grandma kept everything exactly the same. His chair stayed where it had always been. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet. Even the workshop stayed untouched. Months passed, then years. Eventually, Grandma started using the basement for storage. Boxes accumulated, old furniture appeared. The workshop slowly became less of a workshop and more of a corner surrounded by clutter. But the workbench itself remained. Nobody moved it. Nobody dismantled it. Nobody really touched it. It was just there, waiting. The summer I turned 13, my parents started leaving me at Grandma's house while they worked. School was out, my friends were usually busy, and Grandma appreciated the company. That summer was hot, the kind of humid Pennsylvania heat that makes the air feel heavy. The basement became our escape, mine and my cousins. Cool, quiet, away from adults. We'd spend hours down there, playing cards, digging through old boxes, building ridiculous inventions out of spare parts. That's how the tool situation started. At first it wasn't strange. We'd borrow screwdrivers, wrenches, hammers, whatever we needed. And because we were 13-year-old boys, we'd leave everything wherever we happened to finish using it. Workbench, floor, shelves, didn't matter. Then one morning we came downstairs and found everything cleaned up, perfectly organized. Every tool back in place. We assumed Grandma had done it. She said she hadn't. We assumed my uncle had stopped by. He said he hadn't. Nobody thought much about it, until it happened again, and again, and again. Every single time we left tools scattered around, we'd return the next day to find them organized. Not just cleaned up, organized. Exactly the way Grandpa used to keep them. We knew because the pegboard still had faint outlines where the tools had hung for years. The hammer returned to its hook, the crescent wrench beside it, screwdrivers arranged by size, even loose nails sorted into coffee cans. The precision was what bothered me. If somebody was tidying up, fine. But whoever was doing this knew Grandpa's system, and not many people remembered it anymore. Eventually it became a game. We started leaving things out intentionally, testing it, a wrench on a windowsill, a screwdriver under a chair, pliers balanced on a box across the room. Every single item returned, every single time. One afternoon my cousin got frustrated, said somebody was messing with us. So he decided to create a more obvious test. He took nearly every tool from the pegboard and mixed them together in a cardboard box. The result looked ridiculous, like somebody had dumped an entire workshop into a pile. Then we left. The next afternoon we came back downstairs. Every tool had been put away, every single one, perfectly. Neither of us laughed that time, because suddenly it felt less like a prank and more like a problem. The adults remained unconcerned. Grandma blamed one of her sons. The sons blamed each other. Nobody seemed interested in solving it. So Danny and I decided we'd solve it ourselves. We planned a stakeout, very serious 13-year-old detective work. One Friday evening we hid in the basement after dinner. Lights off, flashlights ready, snacks packed. The plan was simple. Wait, catch whoever was organizing the tools, then reveal ourselves dramatically. Probably earn praise from the adults. Maybe solve a mystery. You know, kid stuff. The basement looked very different at night, much larger, much darker. The shadows between boxes seemed deeper somehow. Every sound felt amplified. The furnace clicking, pipes settling, the house creaking overhead. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Around midnight, Danny fell asleep. Around 1 in the morning, I started regretting the whole thing. Then I heard something, a metallic sound, very soft. Clink. Like metal touching metal. I sat upright immediately. The sound came from the workshop. Another noise followed, a gentle scrape, then silence. I shined my flashlight. Nothing. The workbench stood exactly where it always had, tools hanging neatly, everything normal. Then I noticed something. The hammer. It was moving, not swinging, not dramatically, just settling, as if it had been touched a moment earlier. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to convince myself I imagined it. Tiny movement, barely visible. But enough. I woke Danny, asked if he'd seen it. He hadn't. By the time he looked, everything was still again. Neither of us slept after that. We stayed until sunrise. Nothing else happened. The next morning, we checked the basement door. Locked. Windows. Closed. No signs anybody had entered. No explanation. Years passed. Life moved on. Grandma eventually sold the farmhouse. The workshop disappeared. The house belongs to another family now. Most of the people involved have either passed away or moved away. And for a long time, I convinced myself we simply experienced normal childhood imagination. Old basements make strange noises. Metal contracts and expands. Memory is unreliable. Family members can be mischievous. Case closed. Then, about 5 years ago, I ran into the farmhouse's current owner at a local hardware store. We got talking. Eventually, he mentioned the basement, said he'd converted part of it into a workshop. I laughed and told him about my grandfather. The organized tools, the old workbench, the mysterious cleanup. He smiled, then said, "Funny thing about that workbench." I asked what. He shrugged, said, "I still find tools put away sometimes." I laughed, expected him to laugh too. He didn't. Instead, he looked genuinely puzzled. Then he added, "Not complaining, though. Maybe somebody in his family is tidying up. Maybe he forgets doing it himself. Maybe there's a completely ordinary explanation. Like I said, I hope there is. But every now and then I think about my grandfather standing in that basement workshop. Quiet, methodical, putting every tool exactly where it belonged. And I remember what he told me. Things work better when they're where they're supposed to be. Maybe that's all it ever was. A habit so deeply ingrained that generations remembered it. Or maybe some habits are harder to break than others. Anyway, that's my story. And if anybody out there has an alternative explanation for disappearing screwdrivers and self-organizing tool benches, I'd genuinely love to hear it.
Hello. I'm not completely sure why I'm calling, honestly. I think part of me just wants to hear myself say this out loud to another person, because keeping it in my head has started making it feel heavier somehow. I should probably start by saying I'm not a superstitious person. Or at least, I wasn't. I grew up around superstition, obviously. Most people here do. My grandmother had rules for everything: when to cut your nails, when not to sleep, what certain smells meant, why you shouldn't answer if someone calls your name from outside late at night unless you can actually see them. But those things always felt cultural to me, not literal. Comforting habits. Old fears passed down through generations. The kind of things you smile about when you're older. I'm in my 30s now. I live alone in a rented flat in an older building. It's not a bad place, just old enough that things creak when temperatures change and the plumbing sounds like someone tapping pipes together inside the walls. The building has personality. I work from home most days doing some accounting work for a logistics company. Very boring life, honestly. Numbers, spreadsheets, tea, sleep. Same routine every day. And when you live alone long enough, routines become important. You notice when something breaks them. One of my routines involves the ceiling fan. I know that sounds ridiculous already, but just stay with me. The fan in my bedroom is old. Probably older than I am. Slightly warped blades, weak motor, and when it runs slowly it makes this tiny clicking sound. Click, click, click. Not loud enough to bother most people. But once I hear it, I can't stop hearing it. So every night before sleeping, I switch it off. Always. Not usually. Always. I even wait for the blades to stop turning before I close my eyes. That's important. Because what started happening a few weeks ago only makes sense if I know for certain the fan was off beforehand. The first night felt insignificant. I woke up suddenly sometime during the night. No nightmare, no loud noise. Just awake. The room was dark except for the orange glow from a street light outside filtering through the curtains. And above me, the fan was moving. Slowly. Not spinning properly. Just rotating lazily. One full turn every few seconds. Click, click, click. I remember staring at it for a moment with that half-awake confusion where your brain doesn't immediately process what's wrong. Then I checked the switch beside the bed. Off. I actually reached up and touched it to make sure. Still off. At the time, I didn't feel frightened. Annoyed maybe. Curious. I figured the motor probably retained momentum somehow. Old wiring. Cheap fan. Nothing mysterious. Eventually the blades slowed and stopped, and I went back to sleep. But then it happened again the next night. And this time, I noticed something else first. The cold. Not throughout the room. Just above me. Specifically above my chest. It's difficult to describe properly. It wasn't like air conditioning or a breeze. It felt concentrated somehow. Localized. Like standing beneath an open freezer for 1 second. I remember pulling the blanket higher and then hearing the sound. Click, click, click. I looked up. The fan was turning again. Same slow movement. Same unnatural pace. I grabbed my phone to check the time. 3:12 a.m. exactly. I didn't think much about the number initially. But after the third night, I started paying attention. Because it happened again. 3:12, always 3:12. Same coldness. Same slow rotation. Same clicking sound. Now, rationally, I know humans are very good at creating patterns where none exist. I told myself exactly that. Maybe I naturally wake up around that time because of stress or poor sleep cycles. Maybe the fan movement only seems unusual because I'm already awake to witness it. Maybe temperature changes in the building create subtle airflow. All reasonable explanations. But the thing that bothered me wasn't the fan itself. It was the feeling in the room. I don't know how else to explain it except by saying the room felt occupied. Not visually. Nothing dramatic. No shadow figures or voices. Just the unmistakable feeling that you are no longer alone. And once that feeling entered my mind, it became impossible to ignore. A few days later, I mentioned it casually during a phone call with my mother. I regret doing that now. Not because she frightened me intentionally, but because of how quickly she became serious. I laughed while describing it. Told her my fan had developed a ghost. But she didn't laugh. She asked me what time it happens. When I told her, there was a pause. Then she said, very quietly, that is not a good hour to notice things. That sentence stuck with me. Not a good hour to notice things. I asked her what she meant, but she avoided answering directly, the way older people often do when discussing these subjects. Instead, she started talking about my grandmother. Apparently, when my grandmother was younger, she believed there was a period before dawn when the world became thinner somehow. Not haunted exactly. Just less separate. She used to say, there are movements at that hour which belong to neither dream nor waking. I remember rolling my eyes internally when my mother said that. Even then, even while unsettled, part of me was irritated at myself for allowing old beliefs to creep into my thinking. But once an idea enters your mind, it changes how you observe things. And after that conversation, I started paying attention more carefully. Too carefully. That was probably my mistake. The next night before sleeping, I tested everything. Checked the switch. Watched the blades stop. Closed the windows. Locked the door. I even remember feeling a bit silly, even letting out a little chuckle at myself, just thinking how irrational I was becoming. I was tired, so I went to sleep confident I'd solved it, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. Then I woke up. Cold again. That same concentrated coldness directly above my chest. And before I even opened my eyes fully, click, click, click. The sound above me. My entire body went rigid immediately. I looked up. The fan was moving. Slowly, calmly, like nothing was unusual. I sat there frozen, staring upward. That's when I realized how dark it was. Too dark. Completely dark. No clock. No charging light. Nothing electrical functioning in the room. While I was sleeping, the power had gone out. That is not particularly unusual around here. Weather, faulty wires, animal interference, it happens often enough. But no electricity meant no possibility of the motor running. The room was powerless. But the fan continued turning. Then it slowed. Stopped completely. And after several seconds, the rotating slowed and came to a rest. Very slowly. I cannot explain to you how deeply wrong that felt. Not frightening in a loud, dramatic way. Was quietly wrong. Like witnessing something that should not be physically possible. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I called an electrician. I didn't tell him the full story. Just said the fan behaved strangely. He examined everything for nearly an hour. Wiring, capacitor, switchboard, motor housing. Finally, he shrugged and said the fan was old but functional. I asked him directly, can it move without electricity? He laughed immediately. Then stopped laughing when he saw I wasn't joking. He said, maybe slightly from airflow. Not like you are describing. I never told him exactly what I was describing. After he left, I sat alone in the flat for a long time thinking about my grandmother. And that bothered me too. Because I hadn't thought seriously about her beliefs in years. But suddenly I remembered all these tiny things she used to say. Don't stare into dark corners too long. Don't acknowledge certain sounds at night. And most importantly, if something notices you noticing it, leave it alone. At the time, those words sounded poetic more than meaningful. Now they felt different. Because by then, I had started waiting for 312. Every night. And I think anticipation changes a person. The flat itself began feeling different after sunset. Not dangerous. Just aware. I started noticing how quiet the building becomes after midnight. How the pipes stop groaning. How distant traffic fades until even tiny sounds become obvious. The fan itself began bothering me during daytime too. I'd catch myself staring at it while working. Watching for movement. Listening for clicking. One afternoon, I nearly removed it entirely. I even brought a chair beneath it and stood there with a screwdriver in my hand. But I couldn't do it. And I know how irrational this sounds, but part of me genuinely feared that removing it might somehow acknowledge the situation too directly. Like pulling a thread you should leave untouched. That night, I decided to stay awake intentionally. I wanted proof. Something undeniable. I made tea around midnight and sat in bed watching the fan motionless above me. Hours passed slowly. 2:41, 2:56. 3, nothing. I actually started feeling embarrassed again. Then, around 3:10, the atmosphere in the room changed. That's the only way I can describe it. The room became quieter. Not silent. Muted. Like all distant sounds had been wrapped in cloth. And the temperature shifted. That same coldness settled over my chest. Then the fan moved. Not suddenly. Not with a mechanical start. The blades simply drifted into motion so smoothly it looked less like starting and more like continuing a movement I simply hadn't perceived before. One slow rotation. Then another. Click, click, click. I stared at it without blinking. And I had the strongest, strangest feeling of my life. Not that something had entered the room, but that something had always been there. Something patient. Something unnoticed. And somehow, my attention had allowed me to perceive a tiny piece of it. That thought terrified me more than ghosts ever could. Because ghosts are stories. This felt impersonal. Like accidentally becoming aware of a process that exists whether humans notice it or not. I didn't sleep at all that night. And around sunrise, the movement stopped. Gradually. Naturally. As daylight entered the room. Since then, I've changed. Small ways. I don't look directly at the fan anymore if I wake during the night. I keep the light near my bed on sometimes. And most importantly, I stopped trying to catch it begin. Because I've started worrying about something. What if the movement isn't the important part? What if the important part is whatever stands over me while it happens? Anyway, that's it. I know how this sounds. And maybe there's still a completely logical explanation buried somewhere in all of this. Honestly, I hope there is. But every night now, around 3:12, I wake up just before the clicking starts. Like some part of me already knows it's coming. And sometimes, before I open my eyes, I can already feel the cold waiting above my chest. Alright. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
This episode is part of Season 0, featuring crafted tales inspired by folklore, urban legends, classic ghost stories, and the paranormal. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, don't forget to subscribe to Phantom Phone Line, and be sure to share this with a friend who loves the unusual and unexplained. If you want to catch up on previous episodes, check our website at www.phantomphoneline.com for links and more information. We've reached the end of the line for now, but remember to stay tuned and keep listening for the next one, here on Phantom Phone Line. Any views and opinions expressed are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's producers, affiliates, or sponsors. This content is intended for entertainmental purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice or services of any kind. Viewers and listeners should exercise caution, seek professional advice if needed, and are encouraged to draw their own conclusions. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. Some content may be disturbing, sensitive, or triggering to certain audiences. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations is purely coincidental. Some parts of this content may feature elements that were created, altered, enhanced, or modified using digital production tools, techniques, or other advanced production methods, including synthetic or automated processes. All content is the property of Phantom Phone Line and may not be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form without prior written consent.